Hi, cup of tea time, and we're going to discuss Mikhail Gorbachev's death and Mikhail Gorbachev's legacy for us here and now, which means, you know what it means, us in the West, but also for Russians and where Russians might be in terms of their relationship with Gorbachev 50 or 100 years from now. I think I want to try to say some things that will move you and some things that will surprise you. And this is a kind of after-party event following a video on the main channel about Gorbachev, which was a little bit painful for me to make. And not painful in the sense that I always struggle with these videos because I have a health condition and I've got such limited time in which I do several things, YouTube being one of them. But actually from the emotional point of view of not just how lonesome he was by the end of his life, but how lonesome he was for a very specific reason, which is not to do with being wildly misunderstood in Russia, but to do with how unbelievably much he missed his wife. So let's go. Every time I think of Gorbachev's relationship with Raisa, his wife, who died early in 1999, and they were together more than 45 years, I think, it brings me to tears. And it doesn't bring me to tears because Gorbachev felt when she died that his life was taken away from him, as he felt. And he felt that all the way until the end. I mean, he would have thought about her being gone and how he still hadn't recovered from it probably 50 times a day till his last days, even though it was 23 years. And that's not why I'm moved. I'm actually moved because of the beauty of the relationship. I never met Gorbachev. I had opportunities to meet him, which at the time I didn't take because I wasn't fully on top yet of who he really was and what his values were. And when I was very young, I was skeptical of the coherence of his project, which I still am skeptical about. But I didn't take these opportunities because I wasn't ready at the time. So I'm purely commentating from the sidelines, just like you are, and unless you spend time with him. And so for me, his relationship with Raisa is probably as beautiful a partnership as I've ever witnessed in public life, in my lifetime of observing, things happening in the world. It was quite an extraordinary relationship. They really saw each other. She was, by this much, too much, his compass and his rock. She made a lot of things happen in his life and opened up a lot of paths for him, especially in his internal world, and especially in terms of his cultural education. And there's a story that's worth mentioning, and that's that when Raisa and Mikhail came back from the time in Crimea, when he was under house arrest and the putsch was developing to overthrow him or change his course at least, as soon as he came back, he attended to Raisa, who was not well. I think she'd had a minor stroke. Instead of being out, and he needed to be out on the streets with the crowd to deal with what was happening. And it's inconceivable that anybody else, certainly immersed in Soviet protocol, I even think in Western protocol, would have done what he did. In the middle of a political crisis where every hour of action made a difference to his political survival, he chose to be with Raisa. That's an action of a man who is, first of all, incomparably more human than anything that had been in power in that country before, incomparably more human than any of the trash that's in power now in Russia. And I mean, it borders on being not the action of a politician. And, you know, we also know that when Raisa was dying of leukemia in 1999 in the hospital in Germany, that the staff in the hospital didn't know how to handle it because Gobachev was doing some of what the hospital staff was supposed to do. He was changing her clothes. He was doing all of these practical things, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And that relationship moves me no end. And when Werner Herzog made a terribly unsuccessful film about Mikhail Gorbachev called Meeting Gorbachev, I was very grateful to Herzog for putting in a beautiful stretch that was really the heart of the film about Gorbachev's relationship with Raisa, which sort of rescued Herzog's film. Herzog's problem was that he just didn't reach Gorbachev. Gorbachev is really hard to reach unless you speak Russian and you also know him, then he relaxes. So Herzog didn't manage to break any barriers at all, which is unusual for him, but that's what happened. And, you know, Herzog's film is particularly embarrassed by the film by Vitaly Mansky from 2020, which you must watch with English subtitles. And that's really a filmmaker who personally knew Gorbachev for 20 plus years, engaging with him very, very intimately. And it's a very, very, very beautiful film called Gorbachev.Heaven. So there, I find it painful to deal with Gorbachev because of the extraordinary rare beauty of his relationship with Raisa, which is really a model of life partnership that in so many ways accords with my own values. Why don't we talk about the funeral a little bit first, and later we'll get to talking about Putin and Gorbachev. The funeral wasn't a state funeral, which aesthetically I liked, because one wouldn't want too many of these repulsive things that are running the country to be present, celebrating, acknowledging Gorbachev's life. It was well attended, given that basically now going to Gorbachev's funeral or to any ritual associated with it that's public puts you on a list, basically. You have to make a very conscious decision if you're going to Gorbachev's funeral. It's not like, you know, I love him, he made a lot of mistakes, but I want to acknowledge his life. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip that football practice. I'm going to skip, you know, my kid's piano lesson. I'm going to go and attend the funeral. No, I mean, it's a significant decision that exposes you to a little bit of risk. Not huge amount of risk, but a little bit of risk. So that was interesting. But I think the key thing, of course, is that Putin didn't attend. And we need to talk about that a little bit. Putin has always been extremely pious, partly in a fake way, about the office of president. Putin knows that when the perception that that's a legitimate institution collapses, there ain't much left after that. There is the office of president in terms of perceived legitimacy in Russia. As a political philosopher, I don't regard Putin as a legitimate leader because he is too much at war with too many of his own people within the country to be legitimate. But the perception of legitimacy is there. Once that goes, things begin to fall apart. So Putin is extremely conscientious about that. And as a result, a few years ago, he wouldn't have missed that funeral for the world. Yes, he would have gone to be one-on-one with Gorbachev's body too before, because that's an essential kind of statement. He is one terrible president, he is one good president, but they're both presidents. and you've got to take that seriously. But to take that one further step and go to the funeral, he chose against because it exposed him to too much risk and needless risk. In other words, he felt that this microscopic risk of, destabilizing public opinion against him, Russians would not have liked to see Putin at Gorbachev's funeral, because Russians have extravagantly delusional views about themselves, their country, where they're going, where they've come from. So Russians, on the whole, wouldn't have liked Putin there. And just a few years ago, he would have gone over the top of that and said, no, they can feel whatever they want. I hate Gorbachev. I don't feel like being there. But it's so vital to emphasize the importance of the office of president. I'm going to go. But now he said, well, look, is this going to make me 0.001% less popular? Yes, it will. Well, it's too risky now. And what does that mean? Well, that means that there is a tear in the Putin regime. Putin introduced the tear on Feb 24, 2022. And when he introduced that tear, he felt that the tear would be much smaller than it proved to be. And he felt that the tear both had a chance of healing, and even if it didn't heal, the benefits in terms of the consolidation of Putin's personal power would be significant enough for it all to be worth it. And of course, we know that there's various kinds of visionary and civilizational thought that's gone into the beginning of this war too. So I think that is very interesting. I think that that's totally in keeping with Putin's character. That's to say that he's happy to take very big risks, but risks which he feels have no upside, he is now sort of feverishly avoiding. So that's my take on Putin's non-attendance. What was Gorbachev ideologically? And what the hell is going on? Why am I being so positive about a guy who I feel had a project that was doomed to fail, who has an ideology I don't share? What am I doing being so positive about him? What was this man's ideology? And wasn't his ideology an inherent obstacle to his project being successful? The project of glasnost, Perestroika, the reforms he introduced leading somewhere good. This is interesting. So I personally don't think that Gorbachev's ideological delusions were something that was one of the inherent factors that were going to stop him from succeeding. Other factors were going to stop him from succeeding. The fact that he didn't understand how weak and inept the institutions of the country were. The fact that he underestimated how much opposition that he allowed to develop within the country would already be active and politically active. The fact that he underestimated how much the Politburo would pull him back. The fact that he underestimated the inevitability of a national reassertion against an historical empire that's generated a great deal of justified anger. I think among all of these, while his commitment to a socialist project may have been delusory, it didn't necessarily stop him from failing, from succeeding necessarily. So how come this is the case? Let's look at this. Gorbachev is a Stalinist as a boy, and so many people were. And even when two of his grandfathers were repressed, one of them, I think the dad's dad, was put down to be executed during the purges in the 30s. And then when he wasn't executed fast enough, after a lot of really ghastly and horrendous torture, was released and found to be innocent of anything, just declared to be innocent, just the way people are arbitrarily declared as guilty at that point. Even through that, Gorbachev, as a kid, felt, and that grandfather who was tortured felt, Stalin can't know about this. And so Gorbachev writes this sort of celebrated essay as a school child about all sorts of yucky, qualities that Stalin, the great leader, had. Goes to university, begins to broaden his mind. Over time, gradually becomes familiar with Stalin's crimes. A bit more when he moves from the Stavropol area to Moscow, and then a bit more when he moves from Moscow into the very heart of the regime, as it were, to become the general secretary. He found out more and more and more and more, and it's only as general secretary that he found out everything. And he indeed looked at documents pertaining to his own family history, and he realized that he was the successor of a bunch of bloodthirsty, let's not use the word monster, but whatever. And he was astonished by all of this. He was astonished by the mass gangsterism of the regime. He was shocked by all of these edicts to execute 100 people, execute 200 people, and make them suffer and kill them like dogs and so on. The guy he felt was the most repulsive of them all, from reading these records, he thought was Kaganovich, who actually died in the early 90s. And that sort of disabused Gorbachev as far as Stalinism went, and he was always clear from then on that Stalin was a monster, clear with himself and eventually clear in public. And he did, however, remain a Leninist. And even at the end of his life, he would say things like, Lenin is our God. And that's because Gorbachev, of course, was a very free man. I mean, you have to be a complete nutcase to say that in public and think that's going to go down well, especially when you're mainly being received by a Western audience, because Russians hate him anyway. But he was very, very free, and so he would just say what he felt, and that's what he felt. He was very much not an intellectual. If he were an intellectual, he couldn't say that. He would recognize that Lenin was a gangster too. But in his mind, he somehow twisted a hypothetical story in which there's enough good to be rescued from Lenin. And what was it that was to be rescued? It was a kind of socialism, but a very moderate kind of socialism, which was really to do with a vision of, let us say, Sweden, and maybe not even Sweden as it was a few decades back, but Sweden as it has been imagined, Sweden as it was imagined to be. So some kind of slightly utopian vision of the most perfect version of the most perfect Scandinavian dream for social democracy. That was really where he wanted to go eventually. So why didn't that stop him? Why didn't the particular ideological project not being realizable stop him? Even if you find that that project could be coherent anywhere at all, you're still going to say, well, it's certainly not going to be coherent in the Soviet Union at that point. That country had no history of respect for institutions. It had no history of citizens with a deep and entrenched sense of their responsibility, the boundaries of their responsibility, the institutions around them. All of these liberal traditions were what Gorbachev needed, in fact, to begin realizing anything like his project. That was pie in the sky. But the reason I say that it's not ideology that stopped him, it's because he was so much not an intellectual and so much not even a kind of dogmatically ideological politician. He was above all a leader. He did have, and that's what I say in the video on the main channel, he did have, I think, love that was at the center of his conception of leadership, which really meant I'm going to engage with my citizens in a very inclusive and aspirational way. And even if all my citizens tell me to go screw myself, I'm going to still engage with them aspirationally. And that's what Gorbachev has done all his life, in fact, because all his life he's heard, since retirement, he's heard abuse about his legacy and his contribution. He continued to be aspirational. And again, I include this little clip in the main channel video where he's asked by Vitaly Mansky, come on, nobody likes you here. And he says, well, yes, they do, just give it time, and it's about moving where the people need to move and so on. But basically, Gorbachev was not so ideological as to not be able to react pragmatically and spontaneously to whatever should appropriately be the next step toward the realization of his project. Other conditions weren't in place for it to be realized. It was doomed to failure, in my view. And the only alternative was to introduce coercion, something he absolutely refused to do, and what everybody else in his place would have done. You know, if it wasn't for Gorbachev, at that point in 1991, Russia moves to where Belarus is now, and that becomes the fate of all of the independent countries that were then Soviet republics wanting independence. Eastern Europe would probably be in trouble, but would have a chance of getting away. But anyway, I think basically, interestingly, what I want to say is that we don't want to say that Gorbachev's ideology doomed his project. I think other things doomed his project. His ideology was not, it was romantic more than it was coherent. And it was less a motivational driver for Gorbachev than just the idea about having certain humane values that he was himself cultivating year by year, and then making sure that his actions were increasingly in accordance with them. And so now something follows from this, and I'm going to tell you something that's clearly a lie, and something I would never tell you if we were having a one-on-one coffee, but we're having a sort of almost one-on-one coffee, so I can tell you this lie to nudge you in a certain direction, in the direction of truth, of course. Gorbachev didn't want to keep the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was working to abolish the Soviet Union intentionally. And you might say, well, Vlad, of course that's not true. Everything he's ever said is about how he wanted to preserve the Soviet Union in a reformed shape. And that objection is, of course, correct. But why am I saying this lie? It's because what Gorbachev ultimately envisioned was a situation where there was a union between the ex-Soviet states that was way closer to the European Union as it looks today, or something like the European Union, than to the Soviet Union. He wanted to move from the empire model to a model of cooperation, possibly even with more fiscal cooperation than political cooperation. And he hoped that as all of these countries were moving in that direction, that at least for a while he could be president of all of that until whatever happened next happened. And so of course he wanted to keep the Soviet Union. But what we've got to be clear is that his dream, which is just pie in the sky in my view, it was never going to happen for all kinds of reasons. I mean, just the republics themselves were too angry with this history of empire to want to have a European Union with Russia, and Russia was never capable of acting in that union the way he would have wanted it to act. But that's where he wanted to go. And moreover, beyond that, his dream would be that there'd be a kind of union that transcended all of this, and there'd be one single European Union that involved Ukraine, included Ukraine, Britain, and Russia. All of these countries could be there. So that's very far removed from the decisions he was making and what he could plan for a year or two ahead. But that was his dream. And so there is a certain kind of sense in which he did want to abolish the Soviet Union, because where he wanted to move this whole thing is so radically different to where it was. But of course, I do think that this is a vision that is so spectacularly naive as to be almost childish. And I think gullibility was always, and a kind of naivety, were always a part of Gorbachev getting into trouble with his political projects. He was also spectacularly not naive in some ways, but there were areas in which he was very naive. And I mean, let's just take one example. Long after he was running the country, he tried to form a socialist party in Russia. And he went through all the hoops. And don't forget, Gorbachev is excluded from public life by Yeltsin. He is excluded from public life by Putin, except right at the beginning of Putin's reign. And nobody really is keen to give him much of a platform or much of a voice. And he tries to form this party. And he gathers all the signatures, he does all the bureaucracy, and he's still not being registered. And he's going around to his friends and saying, what the hell is going on? I've done everything. They're asking me to do more, and they're asking me to do more, and I keep doing it, and they're still not registering me. What is this about? And at one point, Surkov, who is a very interesting machinator, sort of had to break it to Gorbachev, and he said, look, Mikhail Sergeyevich, how can you not understand it by now? We are not going to let you form this party. You've done enough, you've been out there, you've run the country, enough. You're not going to be allowed to do it. Why are you so naive about this? And Gorbachev was feeling, well, but this is not about me. It's about people needing a kind of representation. I mean, after all, even if Russia lets go of what we might call the more extreme forms of left-wing politics, it's still a profoundly left-wing country. If you ran a free election in Russia now, it would be shockingly left. The result. It would terrify the anti-Putin opposition, who are, I would say, still now mostly center-right. They're increasingly becoming center-left, but they're very center-right historically. So come on, he was saying, the people, come on, they need representation. No, Mr. Gorbachev, please, what are you doing? And that gullibility when he was in power, I think also combined with a kind of hubris, because he was clearly remarkably gifted politically. He wasn't just some kind of person who was on a humanistic journey. He was a politician too. So he wasn't like Bernie Sanders, let us say. He was a much more sophisticated political machinator than Bernie. So he had real political, and he was over-impressed with his own political talent, and over-impressed by the fact that he could achieve great things in a certain dimension, he could therefore achieve them in other dimensions. And so naivety combined with hubris for Gorbachev at the end. And that's partly why he lost control so quickly. He felt that the fact that he pulled this unbelievable trick, it wasn't a trick, it was also part of himself evolving, of persuading this eye-wateringly tyrannical and reactionary regime to put him at the heart of it and to trust him. And then he kept the reactionaries around him mostly on board, or fired them successfully. what was extraordinary about Gorbachev coming to power is that some of the very reactionary shoulders he stood on, he began firing them as soon as he got to office. But that went to his head a bit, and he felt he could, indefinitely control all of these radical conservatives in his inner circle. He felt he could control the political opposition that he was himself allowing to develop. He felt he could control the inevitable consequence of the freedom he was giving, which is that people wanted more freedom than he was giving and more quickly. So, yes, I think that is interesting. There was always a kind of lovable gullibility that went alongside extraordinary capacity for self-discipline, for not saying things he thinks, for keeping secrets, for acting and mimicking in order to appear a certain way, which is much of what he was doing before he got the general secretary position. So there, a bit of naivety. I'm just thinking, there's something else that's part of my personal reaction to Gorbachev that I want to share with you, and that's about how I am moved by his relationship with being seen. People have very different relationships with being seen, and the relationships people have to being seen are very important to me. It's very important for me to see your relationship with how you need to be seen by the world and by the people who you need to recognize you, whether in your professional life or in your personal life. And my relationship to being seen is extremely different to Gorbachev's, but it's very important to me. Which is to say that there are some people who don't care about being seen at all. And I'm somebody who doesn't care at all about being seen in almost every aspect of life, but in some it's really critically important to me. So what's special about Gorbachev's relationship with being seen that I don't share but moves me very much is that he has a deep need to be seen, not just by an elite of people who really get what's going on, but by people in his country. In other words, it's injurious to him to be wildly misrepresented by millions upon millions of people in his country. Somebody else in his place would say, well, I'm sorry, but there are 17,000 people in the world who get exactly who I am and think that, I am a great political leader. That's enough. But no, Gorbachev, that doesn't fix it for him. He needs these millions to vaguely recognize, and that's why he is so tied to this idea that, eventually things will come about and Russians will recognize his contribution. And that's not my relationship with being seen at all. I don't care about being seen at all by large numbers of people. I mean, I appreciate it, but it's not it's a love to have, but not a need to have. But I do have a need to have being seen, and I have a painful relationship with it. And that's to do with philosophy and maybe to a certain extent musical aesthetics. And what that need is about is that, for 18 years, I've been living with a health condition that's got much better. You know very well, if you watch these videos regularly, that for a few years I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk. And that's dramatically delayed my contributions to basically professional philosophy and maybe some kind of musicological writing too. And if I die before that contribution is made and before the 11 people in the world who I'm interested in recognizing this contribution recognize it, I'll feel in a certain way unseen. I'm very blessed and seen in my private life, so I have nothing missing there. But in terms of that professional contribution, this is very painful to me. And it's painful to me that I can make considerable progress with it right now, as I am making, but I'm working with probably 2 hours of sort of work time a day instead of 8 or 10 or 12. And that dramatically transforms what I can contribute. And so, therefore, I have pain around this question of being seen. I don't have pain about being seen in this context at all. So, as a public intellectual, it's not essential to me to be seen. But as an intellectual, it is important to me to be seen. And so I have pain around it in a very different way. Gorbachev has pain around it, and so I relate. So let's talk a bit about, how does one ethically balance the violence that happened at the breakup of the Soviet Union in terms of Gorbachev's responsibility, accountability. In my video, I said that he has blood on his hands, which is a vague thing to say, I must admit. I mean, there is no leader of a major power that doesn't have a lot of blood on their hands. So what does that really mean? But then I said he is responsible and he allowed it. And I was talking about the events in Vilnius, where a lot of people were injured, 14, 15 people were killed. But I could have been talking about Riga or Baku, Tbilisi, and so on. So how do we judge this? I think there is a couple of things to balance here. One is less interesting to me because it's just not my area to judge, which is exactly what the orders and instructions were and where they came from. It's uninteresting to me because Gorbachev is responsible for it. I think that plenty of Gorbachev's sympathizers would say, look, the people who inspired these events were the very people who were trying to overthrow Gorbachev. A lot of things were happening behind his back at the time. I don't need to get involved in these events because there's a basic in these arguments because there's a basic level of responsibility he holds. And in my capacity as a moral philosopher, how do I assess his responsibility? Well, I think that strangely, at the level of how he's carried it, I'm impressed with it. At the level of how he has spoken about it, I am not impressed with it. I think that at the time he found these events very painful, and even from a very self-serving point of view, painful because they were just catastrophes for his project of keeping the Union together. But I think over time, he's been thinking about them a lot. He's found them very, very painful, and he went through a process of kind of humanistic evolution and became allergic to violence more than he was back then, even though back then he was extremely allergic to violence relative to everybody around him. I mean, Gorbachev was being tugged and pulled into the most ghastly actions that he didn't take by people around him. I think there's even a record of him telling the at the time soon-to-be leader of Georgia, Eduard Shevardnadze, to stop his hawkish squawking about the future former Soviet republics and what should be done with them. So relative to the people around him, he was very impressive, but he made a big evolution since office. And he's continued to find these events very painful. And his allergy to them was kind of healthy in the sense that it wasn't an allergy that made him not want to go there. It was an allergy that changed him and made him more intolerant of violence. I would say so intolerant that 10 years on, he probably would have been actually incapable of major political office. He couldn't have taken the decisions major politicians take. That would have been too bloody for him. So, I mean, really major politicians take. You could probably run a very small country bloodlessly. But was there the proper kind of public acknowledgement? No. So that's about Gorbachev's responsibility. But what about how we should judge the reaction of folks in the, countries that were victims? it should be mixed. It should be mixed because, the first leader of Lithuania, Landsbergis, tweeted, Gorbachev is ghastly and look at what he did, we'll never love him, as soon as Gorbachev died. Fair? Fair. But what's also fair? Well, what's also fair is that if it's not for Gorbachev, in the early 90s, Landsbergis is not running the country. Landsbergis is in the kitchen, privately criticizing the Kremlin. That's it. So, no politics for Landsbergis in the early 90s without Gorbachev. I'm sorry. No independence. No independence, for any of these countries without Gorbachev. So it's difficult to put yourself in somebody's place, but quite certainly if I were, let us say, Ukrainian, I would be very conscious of all kinds of unlovely things Gorbachev has said, of all kinds of things Gorbachev has never really understood about Ukraine, even though in Privolne, where he grew up, it was sort of ethnically 50-50 between Russians and Ukrainians. He is 50-50. Raisa was 50-50. When Gorbachev sang songs, which is nearly all the time, he almost mostly sung in Ukrainian. He spoke Ukrainian. But his views about Ukraine were very flawed. But nevertheless, if I were Ukrainian, I would look at the big picture and what's the main takeaway for me about Gorbachev? Well, no Gorbachev, no Ukrainian independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Sorry. So my main reaction would be thank you. And that has to go as at least a factor in one's ethical response all over the place. There is something else that's really interesting here. And that's that at the recent Freedom, well, how do you translate this? The Freedom for Russia Forum, which took place in Lithuania, they deliberately, and people like Gary Kasparov were justifying this, deliberately didn't do a minute of silence for Gorbachev. And that's a Russian forum about the future of Russia's political destiny. That could have been handled in all kinds of ways, but the way they handled it is absolutely inconceivably politically stupid. Because if you don't start by recognizing that in Russia's history Gorbachev stands for freedom even more than Yeltsin in some ways, you can't go anywhere. And so what that makes of the opposition is that they become just sort of anti-war activists that risk being utterly irrelevant to the purposes of Russians and the purposes of the world, which is what? To change Russia. So they either would have done the minute of silence for Gorbachev at their meeting, even if it was in Lithuania, which is what I would have done, or they would have said, you know what, we're not going to do it here, but we're going to commit ourselves to doing a really big special acknowledgement of Gorbachev next time when we're not, when we're gathered not on Lithuanian soil, or something like that. They had to do something. So the fact that they are not incorporating Gorbachev into Russia's history of fighting for a minimum degree of freedom necessary in the modern world is extraordinary. And make no mistake about it, the catastrophe of the Putin regime is not a catastrophe from which Russian opposition is immune. It's a catastrophe of extraordinary impoverishment and evacuation of political imagination. Yeah. The vast majority of the Russian opposition are guilty of that too, unfortunately. And so what follows from this? What follows from this is that despite, and we'll talk about this more, let's glorify the Russians who are opposing the regime, but let's not necessarily glorify them as effective political agents. There's a crisis of political efficaciousness in the Russian opposition. Yeah, that is eye-watering, absolutely eye-watering. So what does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with this, that however delusional Gorbachev's project was, his was the last coherent project offered toward Russia's political future. That's it. Gorbachev's vision for the future of the country is the last coherent political proposal, a delusory proposal that in many ways was doomed to fail. But it's the last coherent putting together of a picture for the future of that country. And why do we care about that terribly much? Because on that depends how we relate to Russia outside, you know? What do we expect from Russia? If we expect from Russia to just be a kind of a Putinist hellhole, that means there's one kind of relationship we have to have with it. That means it'll always do these wars. It means it cannot be part of Europe. If we expect this period to at some point be over, that's a different kind of relationship. It means different policies. It means different ideas about how we think of ourselves in Europe, who we are and what is part of Europe and what is not part of Europe. So these are very, very important ideas for us all, not just for Russians. And what is palpable at the moment, and what Gorbachev reminds us of, is the absence of a coherent political project for Russia's political future. You know, it's not a project to say we've got to end the Putin regime and stop the war. That's not politics, that's activism. So it can be good activism if you manage to stop the war, sure. But that's not Russian politics. That's just activism. And so we're waiting for more political seriousness from Russia's opposition. And Gorbachev, as much as he wasn't fully a politician in some ways, because he was this kind of evolving humanistic figure, he reminds us of this extraordinary absence that teaches us that the crisis of politics in Russia isn't just about the regime. So why is Gorbachev so hated in Russia? I named a few factors in the Gorbachev video, from the perception of total decay at the end of the Soviet period, then the trauma of the early 90s, which was blamed on Gorbachev to a good extent, the craving for recognition for the country on a global stage, a kind of imperial missing limb syndrome that Russia is acutely suffering from. And we could name plenty of other factors, but I think I want to put just one on the table, and that's propaganda. The people who didn't fall for Soviet propaganda, who were grown up enough to fall for it or not in the 70s and 80s, have now fallen for Putin's propaganda, which is interesting. And as we discussed, it's because it's better quality propaganda in part. But the story that the Putin regime, above all, has tried to drill into Russians is that the fall of the Berlin Wall is a gross violation of Russia's national interest, and those who allowed it to happen need to be punished. That has been a message drilled into Russians by the Putin regime for years. And Gorbachev has been a victim of that. So what about Gorbachev's weak critique of the Putin regime and no critique of the war, except a message from his foundation that the war must be stopped immediately on the 26th of February, 2 days after it started? Nothing from him apart from that. What do we make of that? And what do we make of his sort of inconsistent and very held back criticism of the Putin regime? Well, I mean, he clearly felt that the war was just the final nail in the coffin, and that's why I share this thing that he said to Dmitry Muratov, who then told it to Venediktov, who then told it to the world, that Gorbachev felt that we'd need to start again because everything was now ruined by this Putin regime and by the war. But he was very sick. He was moreover in COVID isolation. He wasn't seeing many people. He was seeing Dmitry Muratov, who socializes a bit less than Alexei Venediktov. They were seeing fewer people, so they said that Muratov should go to the to do the hospital visits with Gorbachev instead, less COVID exposure. So it was brief phone calls which kept Gorbachev in touch with the world, really. And what we gather from that is that he basically thought everything was ruined. That was not far from being ruined before, but this was the final nail in the coffin. And Gorbachev was also, of course, in many ways, not quite a pacifist, but a man with an increasingly pacifist disposition. I think in his mind, there could eventually be that's, a thought that I would, of course, call naive, a human world, which was nearly a world without war, and we should be moving toward that. But he, first of all, was appalled by it. Secondly, he felt that he was not in the right position to say more than what he said. And what he said basically has come out via his friends or via that Gorbachev Foundation statement. Well, why wasn't it more? Why didn't they record a video from the hospital bed? I'll tell you one factor there, and that's a combination of it feeling useless to him because he is excluded from public life in Russia anyway, nobody listens to him, and the feeling that there'd be real risks and not great benefits attached to that. I suspect that the fear that Putin has generated is part of this story. And I don't want to evaluate it, but I do think that this utterly repulsive regime could have acted on this in some way. Because, of course, any statement by Gorbachev is 15 years in prison. And he didn't do it. I don't want to assess that, but quite certainly the Putin regime created conditions in which it wasn't easy for Gorbachev to make that statement. I think he would have done something powerful if he had had his health, but he didn't. So there we go. And much earlier during the Putin regime, what he would do would be to only make criticisms where he felt that the course of policy could be altered by his intervention, and never make criticisms that were just moral criticism that would have no political efficacy. He kind of behaved like a politician and spent a lot of time swearing in private at the Putin regime. But really in private. He didn't even in company want to express this too much. And he also didn't express his absolutely visceral hatred of Yeltsin. He felt that Yeltsin's personal ambition ended his project, and he felt that Yeltsin, just out of personal ambition, was committed to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and that's not entirely unfair, I must say. And I'm comparatively an admirer of Yeltsin. And Gorbachev, in particular cases, took the sides of vulnerable people and vulnerable organizations and pounded the presidential administration uselessly, of course, in private with letters and appeals. So there, I don't want to evaluate it, but here's a kind of irony. Putin's created such a regime of fear that now Putin is himself scared to go to Gorbachev's damn funeral, and he's created a situation where Mikhail Gorbachev is worried about having a very uncomfortable few days and weeks of his life by saying something more than he did say about the war. Very, very ugly stuff, and I'm grateful to you for joining me on this conversation. I wanted to tell you that the next chat we're going to have, I'm going to call 50,000, because quite a while ago the main channel reached 50,000 subscribers. Our videos have always been getting many more views than that, but I wanted to use the opportunity of that milestone to tell you about the future, where we're going, and how I want our missions, whatever your mission might be, probably to just better and with more hope make sense of this world, and my mission of speaking to you and speaking to the world, how we can align our missions more richly and interestingly going forward. That's going to be the next chat on this channel. Thank you for keeping me company through this ramble. Lots of love.